Tucked between two bustling streets in lower Manhattan, you'll find the small yet vibrant Elizabeth Street Garden. But the city plans to redevelop the garden into a housing complex. Some residents are now furious.
So one of the last public gardens in lower Manhattan will soon be torn down and replaced with housing for the homeless. And local residents are furious, but the city says it's got no choice because the vulnerable deserve a place to stay. And apparently that place is going to be right over here in one of New York City's most expensive, most exclusive neighborhoods.
The city wants to turn a beloved sanctuary on the edge of Little Italy into affordable housing, but supporters of that Elizabeth Street Garden say that plan's not going anywhere, at least not yet.
It's like a spiritual home for me. It's where I come to breathe.
Tony Farquharson has 3 children. When they're trying to find housing, I have Section 8, but most people don't want to take Section 8. They want you to go out to the Bronx.
Everything is the Bronx, the Bronx, the Bronx. It's hard to get Brooklyn, Queens, or Manhattan.
The city owns the property and wants to sell to a developer which will construct a mixed-use building that will include 123 units of affordable housing, part of a massive plan to solve the affordable housing crisis. 50 of those units will go to seniors currently homeless.
I get calls every day, all day, of seniors who are in tears because they don't believe they will have a roof over their heads.
The whole community recognizes the need for affordable housing. We also recognize that you don't have to destroy this garden to get it.
When we talk about housing, people often say, well, why don't you move it down the block? And I keep trying to tell people, I need that property down the block too.
So prominent leaders from all across our political spectrum are teaming up to save this garden. But even though everyone agrees we need more affordable housing, every time the mayor tries to build it, he's met with protests and backlash from self-proclaimed progressives, revealing the dark truth about housing here and why it will likely never be affordable. With critics going so far as to say that pretentious New Yorkers who aren't homeless simply don't want low-income people living in their neighborhoods. And that's because as progressive as many New Yorkers claim to be, their minds are filled with fear over anything that could cause their pricey apartments to lose money. Which is exactly what some say would happen if new, modern, affordable apartments start popping up all over the place down here. And what we're talking about is simple supply and demand, because if there are more apartments, prices have to fall. And the demand for your 200-year-old Soho one-bedroom condo won't be as high if places that are bigger and newer and cheaper get built right next door. And the neighborhood won't be as exclusive as it once was. Which perfectly explains why a city full of progressives who claim to care about the less fortunate always seem to stop caring when the less fortunate might become their neighbors, which is why there are always protests demanding that low-income homes be built somewhere else. But look around, there is nowhere else, which brings us to the real reason why affordable housing initiatives in this city always fail or never go far enough to make a dent in our housing crisis. And that's because most of the time they're illegal to build. And even though New York City needs 450,000 homes over the next 9 years to maintain current affordability levels, it's illegal to replace the tiny buildings down here with the taller apartments you'd logically need to cure our housing problems. But if building things here is virtually impossible and the structure that's going to replace this garden is only going to house around 100 people, is that really going to cure our housing crisis? Is it really worth destroying? The city thinks it is. So here we are at the Elizabeth Street Garden, which is run by a non-profit and is open to the public, but could soon be hit with an eviction notice any day now. And they're essentially living on borrowed time because the city's already got permission to demolish it.
The Elizabeth Street Garden has been charming locals since the early 2000s and has grown in the last 12 years. It's also crowded with people lounging in every nook and cranny. The community volunteers running this unique community.
So before we get into whether or not it's better to destroy this place and build houses for people who don't have them, we've got to understand that it's been here for almost 2 decades, and it's special. There's not a whole lot like this anywhere. You can see there's a whole bunch of people hanging out, enjoying themselves. It makes the neighborhood unique. It's hosted musical events, movie nights, and it's the only park of its kind anywhere in this neighborhood. And when it's open, it's full of people just relaxing and enjoying a little bit of peace in this otherwise noisy, concrete city. Yet this city is in the worst housing crisis it's experienced in the last 50 years with just 1.4% of apartments available to be rented, leading to apartment prices that are too high for many families to afford, and that's forcing them to leave the city. Yet at the same time, this garden, it's very special. There's not too much like it, and once it's gone for good. But in spite of that, the city has been trying to tear it down for the last 10 years.
For more than a decade, the city has eyed this city-owned lot for its potential to build affordable housing. And now Mayor Eric Adams wants to turn this park into Haven Green, 100 plus affordable apartments for seniors.
So back in 2017, this site was selected as the development location for an affordable housing project. It's set to be dismantled so a building with 123 apartments can be built here, with 40% of those going to formerly homeless individuals. Individuals who would not be able to live here otherwise, as this neighborhood is insanely expensive. And buying something in this part of town is so expensive, most of the country cannot afford it. Look at this, one-bedroom apartment down the street, $2 million for a one-bedroom. That's what a housing crisis looks like, and that's the reason why this garden is on the chopping block. But think of the mindset of whoever owns that place. If you shell out $2 million for a property around here, the worst thing that could happen to it would be for it to lose money. You may never get it back, especially if the city opens up the floodgates and starts building things all over the place. So property owners have an inherent disposition to being opposed to affordable housing once they own their own home. And that's why there are often mass protests, demonstrations, and lawsuits whenever the city tries to build affordable housing in any neighborhood. Because for some reason, it's never the right neighborhood. It should always be built somewhere else, just not here, even though we need it. But the thing is, what's on the other side of this fence is owned by the city of New York. It's their property, and if they want to build something in it, they now have the legal right to do it. A court has established that that's okay. And housing advocates say it doesn't really make sense for people who make over $100,000 a year to be enjoying lattes in a park that could be used to house people who now live on the streets.
50 of those units will go to seniors currently homeless. But many seniors in the neighborhood say it's not a fair trade. Organizers are pushing the city to build elsewhere. The city says they have to build everywhere.
We're in a situation.
So the situation now is that the organizers who take care of this garden, they're pushing for the city to find another location to build affordable housing. But the city, they're pushing back, saying that if there is another location, they're going to build there too. Because in a housing crisis, the city does not have the luxury of being selective about where they build things. They have to build it where it can fit. That's the only option. And at the same time, the city is doing everything it can to try and appease local residents. The new project that will go here is going to have 16,000 square feet of public space. On top of that, they've asked the local community here for input in how the new project should be designed and finished and how it should look, meaning that there's an opportunity for whatever public space does get built here to have a resemblance of what we see here today. But you know, that's a really tough sell because the community's pretty happy with the way things are right now, and changing it and making it less than what it is today won't be enough for everybody. But as you can imagine, in a city like this with so many vested interests on both sides of the affordable housing debate, the other sites the city wants to develop are just as controversial, if not more. So here we are at 388 Hudson Street, and the plans to transform this massive empty lot are just as controversial, if not more controversial, than the plans for the garden, depending on who you speak to. Because the plan here is to build a massive skyscraper which will tower over every other building in the entire neighborhood. Look at this behemoth. And of course, all of the neighbors here are utterly upset about that. They don't want it to happen, but logically, you have to build massive buildings if you have massive amounts of people that can't afford to live in your city, and that's what the city says is making them transform this one just like that garden.
Mayor Adams has now signed an executive order to try and help tackle the city's housing crisis. He is telling city agencies to take a look at all the property they own to determine if any of it can be used to build affordable housing. This department...
Now, if we dig a little bit deeper, we can find out that all of these new development plans that are upsetting residents with spaces that have been a certain way for 10, 20 years, they're part of an executive order on behalf of the mayor for the city to seek out property that it owns and transform it into affordable housing. And the mayor's asking every city agency, law enforcement, fire departments, schools, they're supposed to go through their inventory list of property and see what they've got available that could become something else. And that's a big move because governments usually don't sell their land to private developers, but that's what we have to do to get out of this this housing crisis. We've got to build our way out of it. And even though many locations like the Elizabeth Street Garden are now also on the chopping block, the hope here is that with a critical mass of projects all aimed at creating the affordable housing that has eluded so many New Yorkers, it'll finally happen. But does this mean we're all going to be living in former schools, former jails, repurposed parking lots? No, it doesn't. And that's because whatever the city wants to put in any part of town has to go through a multi-year review process. And there are all of the lawsuits who come from the people that don't want to live next to affordable housing complexes and don't want their properties to lose money or their neighborhoods to change in any way. But is it really fair for people to think that way when there are others who can't find a place to live, when we've got places where housing could be built?
Tony Farquharson has 3 children.
When they're trying to find housing, I have Section 8, but most people don't want to take Section 8 in the Queens, Brooklyn area. They want you to go out to the Bronx, to Staten Island.
Everything is the Bronx, the Bronx, the Bronx. It's hard to get Brooklyn, Queens, or Manhattan.
Yeah, you know, whether you're getting government assistance or not, if you're on a strict budget in this city, finding things that fit within it that are affordable, it's virtually impossible, and you're going to be living far away. Yet we've got places like this where nothing exists. And if you want a plan that does the greatest good for the greatest number of people, building housing in unused parts of town is probably the right way to do it. Otherwise, you're just going to end up forcing out your families, forcing out your middle class. But those are the folks that make New York City run and operate. You can't just have super wealthy individuals and then people who don't have a place to live. That city's not going to function for very long. But as long as the idea of home ownership is that it is a get-rich scheme over a 10 to 15-year period, housing is just going to continue to trend like this. We're never going to build enough housing to lower prices because that's bad for everybody that owns something. And that doesn't mean that if you own a home, you've done something wrong. No, it doesn't. But here in New York, where very few people can own anything that costs $2 million and houses just one person, that's not a system that is sustainable. Something has to be done about that because you've got families who can barely afford to stay here, and we need those families in this city. And if home ownership were as easy here as it is in other parts of the country, New York might not have a ticking time bomb on its hands. But while the obvious solution to New York City's housing problems are just to build as many homes as fast as possible, the effects of not doing that are already starting to turn the city into a dystopian future environment where you've essentially got an entrenched rich population living here along with a transient workforce.
In Harlem, Krista Guidry's home with its fabulous kitchen, rooftop deck, and sweeping city views is a dream come true for a young person with so many options. But this is a co-living space called Cohabs. She shares it with more than 20 people. Her only completely private space is a small bedroom on the 3rd floor, for which she pays around $1,900 a month in a neighborhood where the average...
This is what happens when you don't have enough affordable housing. This right here, people living in tiny little rooms with 10, 20, 30 roommates sharing bathrooms, that's not a sustainable living situation. And because it's not a sustainable living situation, people get into places like that and they can only stay for a few years. Once they accumulate any worldly possessions whatsoever, once they decide to settle down, maybe start a family, maybe move on, they have to move. They can't stay there forever. But this new take on housing called Cohabs is really taking off because this is the only way to lower rent when you're not building things. When you're not building things, you have to take large apartments and chop them up into very small pieces so that people can come and go as their life dictates. But doing this is only going to fracture society even more than it already is because the people living in those tiny apartments, they're so far away from being able to afford the other real estate around here that it likely may never happen. And you basically have people who have generational wealth and will always have it. Not that there's anything wrong with that, but by not making affordable housing, you have other people that are here for a couple of years of their life and then they vanish. This transient population that comes and goes and revolves. On one end, it's a human recycling program, and on the other end, you've got a system and an economy that most people cannot enter. And with home prices just going up and up and up, there's no way that somebody making $50,000, $60,000, $70,000 a year living in a bedroom somewhere is ever going to move into a 4-bedroom apartment that costs millions of dollars. But they could probably live in a 4-bedroom apartment if it didn't cost millions of dollars, and that's the whole idea behind affordable housing.
Krista is part of a growing number of people who are choosing or being forced to walk away from traditional housing. There's this one West Coast company offering people rentals that are so small you can't stand inside and it only fits a bed. These are called pods. Of course, you can show up Monday
Yeah, these aren't homes. These are temporary refuges for people who are on borrowed time. And living in a tiny little apartment like that does serve a purpose. After all, I lived in a place like that when I first moved here. It was the same price as having roommates, and I wasn't going to be homeless if one of my roommates moved out or decided to stop paying rent. But many of my neighbors in that apartment were only there for a couple of years, as was I, and they left the city entirely once they decided that they'd had enough. They were not able to stay in New York and make the place better and build their lives. They had to go build their lives somewhere else. But that's got people asking, is there a solution to this mess? Is there a way to make everybody happy? Well, one solution is to allow private developers to build massive buildings which are all rental property. That will let people come into the city and have an affordable place to live, but they won't necessarily be competing with home ownership. The amount of homes that are for sale, single family homes, single apartments that you can buy will remain relatively the same. That may help those properties